Thanks again for coming tonight. We are on the home stretch now with 3 more First Wednesdays to go. It ends in May, so hope you'll be coming to the other ones. Again, we are grateful to the Vermont Humanities Council, our sponsor, for offering this great series, which is now in 9 libraries across Vermont. And I'd like to thank our sponsors and funders, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs, Racklin Martin, and for the lecture in April, the Wyndham World Affairs Council of Vermont. Tonight's sponsor helping to fund this lecture is KSC Partners and the Vermont Department of Libraries. And I always have the highest kudos for the last mention here, and that's our friends at Brooks Memorial Library, who sell books and do other fundraising events, as the upcoming Say What Do You Know trivia quiz that will take place in this very room on Earth Day, April 22nd. At 2 p.m. So you're all invited to compete. All you got to do is get a team together of 5 or 6 people, and it's a lot of fun. So either see me afterwards or Bob Oser, the president of the Friends, and we'll get your name and put you on a list to get more information. And as I mentioned, the Vermont Humanities Council, there is a mailing list that they would like you to sign up so you can get notified of other events that they do. And there's also a yellow feedback form, and we use this to plan our next year's lecture. So if you wouldn't mind filling one of those out before you leave tonight, and we'll have a basket out at the circulation desk for you to put them in. I'm very pleased tonight to host Michele Barale. She is the Thalheimer Professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies and Director of the Writing Center at Amherst College. She received her PhD from the University of Colorado and has also studied at Loyola University and the University of Heidelberg in Germany. She has a long-time interest in Willa Cather's writing and photography. Her recent publications on Cather have focused on Cather's attitude about artistic inspiration. And I'd like just to read a few words that are on Dr. Barale's website that will give you maybe something to think about when she talks tonight. She says, "I am presently precariously balanced and possibly more often actually tottering between 2 disciplines, literature and art, and 3 interests, Willa Cather, modernism, and photography. Unremarked upon as yet, however, is photography's meaning for Cather as someone who scorns both realism and romanticism, but loves French and American Impressionism, and as the subject of numerous photographs, both formal and vernacular. I'm trying to make sense of Cather's desire to quite literally see herself as artist, even as she refuses to accept her as art, the literally representational. My most recent publications focus on Cather's aesthetics and the complex parts desire and history play in the discovery and creation of beauty." So I'm sure you'll be in for a real treat tonight. Dr. Barale, thank you.
Thank you for coming, first of all, and thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to see so many people who want to talk about Cather, and I can really talk about Cather for a long time. So I'm going to leap right in, and I'm going to tell you that I'm going to start talking about my Antonia, which is a little bit later than the other 2 books I'm going to talk about, because first I'm going to talk about my Antonia, then I'm going to talk about O Pioneers, which is 1913, then I'm going to talk about Song of the Lark, which is 1917. Then I'm going to go back and pick up at the end my Antonia again. I understand that some of you read my Antonia recently, and it is usually considered the best of them all. But let me give you a little bit of an introduction in case you haven't read her, which is to say that Cather was born in either 1873 or 1877, depending on when she's writing her biography. As she neared her 50s, she suddenly had a different birth date. She died in 1947, and that is to say that she was born in the decade after the Civil War. And she went through World War I and World War II. So if you think about that span of American history, and that span of world history, but for me particularly what it means for America to move from the Confederates' war to the end of World War II, is an incredible journey across historical time. And also then to think that Cather is not born here in New England. She's born in West Virginia. When she's a very small child, the family moves to Red Cloud, Nebraska. Let me tell you firsthand, there is nothing in Red Cloud, Nebraska. It still has the original brick roads, cobblestone. Nice and wide because they ran the cattle down them to where the cattle would be put on rail cars and shipped off for slaughter. She was in the middle of nothing. There was a library, and she clearly used it. There were obviously a grade school and a high school in town. There was an opera house because every small town in the West would have an opera house in those days. And so she was part of amateur theatricals and such like. There was a doctor in town. There were several saloons, etc. But she was not part of what I would think of as high culture in any way. She did not have access to it. On the other hand, God, it is also the case that Nebraska was heavily settled by German immigrants. And because of that, those parts of the West that had a heavy German immigrant population were willing not only to throw their money into building an opera house, but willing to throw their money into bringing people from Chicago, Lincoln, and Omaha to put on performances. So while she wasn't obviously in the high circles of art that you would see in New York, neither was she completely without access to what we think of as high culture or high civ or something like that. When she graduates from high school, she leaves Lincoln to go, she leaves Red Cloud to go to Lincoln for college. While there, she's already writing for the Omaha State, Nebraska newspaper, the Journal. And she's writing their music and drama reviews, and she was really, really mean. Really mean. She did a hatchet job on everybody who came. And part of her hatchet job had to do with, I bet they did it better than this when they did it in Chicago. So she was a tough critic, and some of that tough criticism got her a job out of Nebraska and in Pittsburgh, where she worked for a while for a women's magazine, so far as we can tell, writing most of the pieces under pseudonyms. And then she taught high school Latin and English for 6 years in Pittsburgh, and then her story started selling, and she got a job with McClure's magazine in New York in approximately 1912. She moved to New York City. She never moved back to the West, though it is the age of the train. And she was, to follow Cather's biography, is to see somebody who is crisscrossing the country endlessly. Visiting, she comes from a large family, visiting family in Nebraska, going on, coming back to New York, going to the Southwest where she has a brother who's working, coming back to New York, going to Europe because she's working as a newspaper woman, coming back, going to Red Cloud to see her family, coming back, going to Keene, New Hampshire because she has friends. It's just endless, endless crossings of the country. So not only did she grow up, I want to say, in a part of the country that is open and at that time very much free of heavy settlement. Now it's not quite that empty. But she then moves to New York and access to trains and never stops crisscrossing. And she has an eye for landscape. Those of you who read My Antonia saw that. So what I want to talk about is the way in which nature is, for Cather, both I think initially unconsciously and then later very consciously, the source of art, in her estimate, I think, for everyone. But also the way in which nature and art are the same thing. They can't ever be made contraries, and they can't ever be pulled apart, which is to say the natural and the artificial art nature are one and the same for her. Each is endlessly interacting with the other. But what does this mean for a woman who wants to be not a great woman writer and not a great American writer, but who wants to be a great writer? America is too small, and woman is too dumb. She wants to be the writer, like Flaubert, like Proust, like Henry James, but not like Edna Ferber. No, no. So she's very ambitious for herself, and God knows she carried that ambition through with 11 novels, with 3 collections of short stories, and with endless, endless newspaper articles, journal articles, magazine articles. But throughout her life, I would argue she's endlessly trying to figure out, what does art come from? What makes it happen? What does it look like when it's good? And why do we keep making this stuff anyway? So when My Antonia opens, we open with a young boy on a train, Jim Burden. And he's reading one of these awful little dime novels. And it's a dime novel about cowboys. And it's a shoot 'em up. And there are revolvers and horses and outlaws and men with masks. And he's trying to look out the window, and he's also looking around the train. And what's clear to us as the adult reader is that what the child is reading, he's maybe 10 years old, is romance. And what he's in the middle of is reality. And there are immigrants on the train, and they're talking in a language he doesn't understand. And that's what the West is. It's not that silver-plated pistol. He gets off the train. He sees this same immigrant family. That's the family of Antonia. He's picked up by a couple of cowboys who don't really look like cowboys. They're just farm hands, ranch hands. And he's taken to his he is an orphan. He's come to live with his grandparents. He's taken to his grandparents' home and put to bed. And when he awakes in a room that is white and filled with light, that's coming through a small round window high in the wall. And his grandmother comes in and she says, "You look just like your father did when he was your age." And Jim says, "That's very nice." But for us as readers, it's pretty clear that this is a moment of birth, that Jim is enwombed. And grandmother takes him out of the room and she says, "Come on with me into the kitchen." And they move into the kitchen. And she says, "Now, go over there by the stove and wash up. And give yourself a really good scrub because trains are dirty." And he baptizes himself with the warm water. And he has a good breakfast. And he's looking around and he's very curious. And grandmother says, "Well, you do some things and then later you come out. I'm going to be working in the garden. You come to the garden where I am. Be careful. There's some snakes." He goes out to the garden and he sees her working. And he sees great pumpkins and squash and it's a moment of harvest. And he leans back against a great pumpkin. And he thinks, this is what happiness is. To be engulfed in something truly immense and great. And in fact, those are the lines that are on Cather's grave in Keene, New Hampshire. And so in the space of one chapter, Jim is born, baptized, and understands what death is. That it is to be part of something much larger than the self. That the thing that is larger than the self is something about light and air and growth. It's a very non-spiritual sense. And that death and some kind of harvest, but also some kind of winter and then renewal, is all mixed together. You have to start there when you start thinking about Cather and art. My Antonia is a funny book to start with because we don't have any real artists. You know how the novel ends. It ends with Antonia having lost all her teeth with 29,000 children. Right? She's married a man who bears her name, Anton. Has she actually married anybody? Or is she just sort of reproducing herself? And the children emerge out of a cellar in the ground where they've been getting the stored vegetables, and they emerge into the light, all these little tumbling bodies of life. And Jim Burden sees them after many, many years, and he's very moved by this. That Antonia, though she's aged and weathered and toothless, is still the young, beautiful woman he always knew. And clearly, as Jim is aging, and he's kind of a melancholy fellow, and as Antonia is herself withering, she's aging too. The children are emerging, filled with life and energy. And so the end of the novel, I would suggest, shows us something about one kind of art, an art that is about life, an art that is about reproduction, an art that is about ongoingness. But I want to be a lot more specific than that. So I put some handouts. I know I don't have enough. And it's not important for you to have the handout because I'll talk about the sections that are worth paying attention to for what I'm after. Everything's worth paying attention to. And where I'm going to take us to is about a fourth into the novel, maybe a third into the novel, when Jim has grown up enough to leave his grandparents' home and to move into Lincoln, Nebraska, and go to college, just as Cather did. And Jim is living, because there are no dormitories at this time, Jim is living in an old house on the edge of town. He's not in town, and he's not quite on the prairie. He's right on the verge between the two. And the house is owned by old settlers whose own children have moved on, and so they have some space. And he has one room and a closet, and he turns the closet into his bedroom so that he can turn the one room into his big study. And he has a window. The window faces west, of course, onto the prairie. So Jim has left the prairie, he's left the farm, and he's moved to the edge. He's got one foot in the world of the university, and he is as happy as could be. He loves learning. He's engrossed with the classics, which was what Cather majored in. And he's got one foot, at least on the other side of that window, still in the prairie. And I want to read you just a little bit. He says, I learned the world of ideas, and I really loved it. But somehow, some of the figures of my old life seem to be waiting for me now in the new. He says there were a lot of young men at the university just like me. They came off farms. They really struggled and they sacrificed in order to come to college. And they still have something of the farm about them as they move into this new world, a modern world, one thinks, of universities and ideas. But what Cather then writes is that what he does with his study, what Jim does, is most interesting. Because even as he has this window looking out onto the prairie, he puts two pictures on the wall. And one picture is a picture of Rome, a map of the city of Rome, made by a German engraver. And on the other wall, he has a picture of the tragic theater at Pompeii, which has been given to him as a gift. And he has it framed and hung there. So he has a map of a city, gridded in some sense, roads named, places named, and then he has a picture of that site where theater happens. And one thinks of Red Cloud's little theater. And one thinks of what the prairie looks like versus what the streets of Rome must have looked like. And Jim is in both those worlds. He's in the world of European culture, and he's in the world of the West. And he's at a window, and he's between them. He is neither one nor the other. And his memories are what he brings into this new world, and they don't go away from him. So that on his wall, what he has is city and art. Now, this is interesting, I'm going to tell you, because he can't get rid of his thrill with learning, and he can't get rid of his memories of the past. And there's a little bit of tension as he tries to keep both alive. He knows he's never going to be a scholar, but he doesn't know what on earth he's going to be. In fact, he becomes kind of a melancholy railroad man, back and forth, back and forth, unhappily married. One day when he's sitting there thinking, what am I going to be when I grow up? He looks out through his window and he sees high in the sky one bright star. And he says that star hanging up there in the sky looks exactly like a light in a little lamp with silver chains, which is often, I have to tell you, the ampersand is often the little bookmark that goes on the front of books under a title. It's a very classical kind of little European figure. But he looks at nature and he thinks about something that's artificially made. And he looks at nature again and he says, I guess I'm being told it's time to light my lamp. So he closes his curtains and he lights his lamp and he looks at his lamp and he says, now it's like I've got the star again. So he looks at nature, he thinks of art, and he makes something. It's just a light. But he's sitting there thinking, it's a nice room, and he's admiring how the pictures look in the dusk when he hears a knock. And he goes to the door, and he opens it, and there's a young woman standing in the dark hallway, and he can't see her. And so she walks a little further into the room, and she says, you don't recognize me, do you? It is someone from his past. Someone who he had a terrible crush on, Lena Lingard. And what I'm going to say to you is at that moment, when she walks into that room, she's the muse. She is coming to him from the past, but she's all different now. She's very sophisticated. She's beautifully dressed. She has flowers on her hat. And he will again renew his crush on her. And what they immediately do, the first time they can get together, is they go to the theater. Over and over and over again. And she inspires him. He knows he cannot give up his past, and that it is as dear to him as anything could be. And that's where I'm going to leave my Antonia for a moment, with the suggestion that what we see in my Antonia is Cather's notion that the past and memory, that nature and fact are the stuff that makes art. Furthermore, that the American prairie, the soil, the dirt, and I want to say the grandeur that was Rome, that picture on the wall, they cannot be separated, that they come together in us, or at least in the artist. And now I'm going to jump backwards. If my Antonia is 1918, O Pioneers is 1911. I think it's her third novel. And I personally think it's a beautifully structured little novel. It's shorter than my Antonia, and if you haven't read it, I think you might like it. It's sort of sad. But it tells us the story of Alexandra Bergson. And here we get a different kind of artist. Cather is still not working with artists who are artists, She's still not thinking about painters and singers, and she doesn't write about writers, sculptors, photographers. But she's trying to figure out what makes American art happen. What do you do with Europe? What do you do with the Prairie? And in O Pioneers, she gives us a land before it's made. So she takes young people, it's kind of a sad novel, and she opens with them in a prairie town where everything is being blown away. And as these two young people move out of town, they move into a space that is empty of anything legible as human. There are no roads, there are no houses, there are no lights. There is nothing, she says, written upon the land that is human. And it's interesting to think about land as the book, as something upon which the human writes its history. If there's no writing, there is no history. So it's as if these two young people have entered into a world before history begins, a prehistory, and they are alone in a kind of geologic time. What we find is that poor Alexandra is going home to a father who is dying, and indeed does so within weeks. And what he says to his daughter, he has sons, but only one daughter, and she alone is interested in farming. What he says to her is, I'm sorry, I'm leaving you something in which there is nothing recognizable for all the work I've put into it. I've worked my fingers to the bone here, and there is nothing to see. Actually, there is something to see, but it's not outside. It's inside. Alexandra's mother is not to be stopped from canning and pickling everything she can find. She's not a happy woman in this new, raw place. And so what she does is she practically makes the family poor by buying so much sugar that the place is filled. Cather uses the word beacon. It is a beacon of glass jars with all of her preserves. She preserves everything she can find, which is to say, she goes out into the prairie and she preserves weeds and turns them into jams and turns them into pickles, and some of the things work and some of them don't. But what's impelling her to do this is an attempt to recreate inside the house, because nothing can be done outside, is to recreate inside the house what she knew in Europe, what she knew in Scandinavia. Not to in any way change what is American or to become something new, but merely to hold on to what is essentially lost. The novel then switches to 16 years later, and what we find is an Alexandra who has completely transformed the country. As everybody died off or moved out of town, left the farm and went to Omaha, she kept buying their land cheap. And she liked farming. And she studied farming, and she found out what grew. And so 16 years later, there are barns and there are houses, and there are roads and there are cemeteries. There are lights and there are telephone lines. We will find out that Alexandra has a phone and a car. There's mail delivery. People are wearing shoes. It's a whole different world, and history has now been written. And Alexandra is the writer. So if we want to think of the land as this thing that has to be transformed into art, or is the inspiration for art, then we see the farmer as the artist. We see the successful reader of soil and land as the maker of this thing called culture. civilization. It's a very different way of thinking about the artist, and this is early in Cather's career. But I don't think there's any doubt in Cather's mind that this making the soil fertile, making wheat grow, and barns have to be built, is indeed the stuff of art making. It's making the land legibly human. There is some funny kinds of art in O Pioneers. One kind of art is the magic lantern show, where, in fact, the children are very interested in this early in the novel. They bring it's a light source, it's a candle, and they put in front of the candle silhouettes of famous German hunting scenes, and they project them on the wall. So at that moment, what we see as art in the American household comes from Europe, and it's a copy. There is another funny kind of art in the novel. Alexandra's best friend, Carl, who she will at the end of the book marry, and everybody thinks, that's going to be boring. No romance here. Carl becomes an engraver. What does he do for a living? He makes lithographs of other people's pictures. He copies. When he returns and sees Alexandra again after many years, he says to her, you know, I've just spent the last 20 years of my life making copies of other men's paintings. You've been writing the real story. So Cather is, I think, at that moment being pretty clear that what is going to become American art is going to be something that comes from American soil and is not going to be something that is a copy of other pictures or a copy of something European. It's going to be its own thing. Now I'm going to switch and move away from O Pioneers to Song of the Lark. And I'm going to do that because Song of the Lark, as its title suggests, is actually about an artist. It's about Thea Kronberg, who becomes a very famous Wagnerian singer. It's Cather's longest novel. It is a bit of a fanny buster. It does go on and on and on. And she edited it by 2,400 words at some point, which did not make an incredibly big difference. She took out, I'm serious about this, she took out a lot of contractions, and she didn't take out a lot. She just couldn't bring herself to quite pare it down. I personally like its length, but, you know, I do. I'm supposed to. I'm going to pass out at this point. I'm going to ask these nice people if they'll pass. You get one more thing if you're here. Free. Oh, thank you. You get a picture that is the Song of the Lark. I'll just start talking while they're passing it out. The Song of the Lark tells the story of Thea Kronberg, a Swedish immigrant. Her father is a minister and very boring. Her mother does a lot of pickling and preserving, but she's eminently sensible. And Thea has always been interested in music, and indeed she makes some of her money by teaching piano. And as time goes on, it becomes clear they're living in town. They're not on a farm. This is a very civilized little town, Moonstone, Colorado, she calls it, though it's really Red Cloud, Nebraska. The layout of Moonstone is replicant of Red Cloud's layout. As time goes on, Thea grows up and goes to Chicago. And it's in Chicago that she's going to learn to become a concert pianist. And she works very hard, and she meets many fascinating people. You need to know two things first before I actually take you to Chicago. One is that she doesn't have an easy time getting to Chicago. And she has many things that she has to learn. Music is just one of them. She also has to learn something about a somewhat more cosmopolitan, which is in this book to say European, understanding of the world. And she learns this from two different people. She learns it from the Kohlers, who are an older German couple who bring her into the house and whose walls, you're now not going to be surprised when I tell you this, bear pictures from ancient classic texts. Picture of Rome, picture of Pompeii, picture of Julius Caesar's head, a picture, you get the idea, and whose bookcase is filled with German and European classics. And she has her music professor, Herr Wunsch, whose name probably means something like desire. And Herr Wunsch really does a good job of educating her, even though he has a bit of a problem with the bottle. So Thea learns a great deal that is not American from both these sources. She goes off to Chicago, and she works hard with a man who is himself Hungarian, whose wife is Austrian. And they go to many German operas, and she sings in the Swedish church to make a little extra money on Sundays. One day, her piano teacher goes with her to her church, and he hears her singing. And says, "I didn't know you could sound like that." She says, "That old thing. I do that all the time." He said, "You're really good." He has not been saying that about her piano playing. And she is discouraged. And he's discouraged for her because she tries so hard, but it's not coming together. But the voice, he says, I don't know everything, but I know what I'm hearing. It's go there. And he finds her someone, and she begins training her voice and learning all the methods of vocal training, none of which are, I dare say, American. All of her teachers are European. All of the songs she's learning are European. And she comes under the tutelage of another set of Europeans. In this case, the Nathanmeyers. Very expensively, well-educated themselves in Europe, Jews who have spent a lifetime underwriting cultural costs in Chicago. And teacher takes her and says, "Can you do something with her? She has no manners to speak of. She's polite, but she can't manage much. She looks terrible, and she doesn't know how to do anything." And so she learns to become, I want to say, upper middle class, and not a Swedish farm girl from the Nathanmeyers. And they're wonderful teachers, and she gives concerts in their house, and they dress her, and they teach her how to stand at the piano well, how to say a few words to the company who's there to watch her, how to be gracious. So what we are seeing at this moment is the real artist, not somebody who farms and that's art, not somebody who reproduces and that's art. We're seeing the actual artist. And it would seem as if what's making her the artist is Europe. Though I sort of don't want to throw out that little Swedish church where she sings truly bad music. She makes a point of saying it's fairly bad music. She's still discouraged. She wanted to be a pianist. Now she's singing, but where is that going to lead her? What's she going to do next? She doesn't have the money to go to Europe. Who is she? What is she going to do with her life? What will she be when she grows up? And she goes to the Art Institute. And as she's walking through the Art Institute, she walks into a room that's filled with casts of Greek and Roman statuary. So she sees all these beautiful reproductions of the discus thrower, and she's admiring their lines. I won't do too much more of that. She's admiring their lines and their energy. She likes that energy. But then she walks into another room, and she sees a picture that just takes the top of her head off. That's the picture I sent around. It's Jules Breton's Song of the Lark. What she realizes is that she really likes pictures that tell stories. She looks at one picture and she says, oh yeah, I look at that and I can think of them. Look, those two kids in there, it's a picture of a pasha and his court. Those are like my brothers. She looks at another picture and she says, oh, look at how carefully that cow is nuzzling her calf. I like that. And then she says, and look at this. And we say, so this is the familiar Cather. The artist looks to the picture of nature and the girl standing flat-footed in the fields, looking up at the bird, and the artist says, that's what I wanted to see. The one problem is the artist isn't American. The artist is French. Oh. So at this moment of kind of an awakening in the artist, is she awakening to the American land? Or is she awakening to European cultural artistic traditions? The answer is yes. Right? It's both those things. You can't separate it. Land and culture. Same thing. So Taya comes out of this. She's feeling a little bit better. She loves this picture. She goes back to see it a number of times. And at one point, she really needs a break. And what she does, somebody who she knows, who ultimately she will think she's going to marry, he kind of misleads her. And then she finds out he has a wife. And it's another unhappy marriage. All of Cather's main male characters have very unhappy marriages. And so it's not absolutely clear from the novel because it wouldn't have been at the time, but they have a long affair, most of Taya's life with this fellow. At any rate, he has a friend who has a ranch in New Mexico. She goes to the ranch, and in fact, from there she moves out, and she goes and lives in the cliff dwellings that the ancient people had built. She just climbs up into the hills, up and up and up and up, and she literally unrolls her bedroll in one of the houses built into the wall, dug out of the wall, where somebody had lived centuries and centuries before. She cooks on a little fire. She goes and bathes in a pool of water that is there. She collects her water from a stream. And she's starting to feel as if things are coming together for her. And one day as she's looking around in this cave house, she finds a shard from a pot. And she realizes that she's been seeing shards everywhere, that there are all kinds of pot pieces. And she looks at it and she thinks, that's what music is like. That is what my singing is. My singing is like this vessel meant to hold water. And I simply enclose the water that is music. That's all I do. I just form the vessel for it, and the music is the thing that makes the art. I am nothing other than its vessel. She keeps looking at the pot, and she says, it's really weird. There are hundreds of these shards, and every single one of them is beautifully decorated. They didn't have to decorate these. All they needed was a container to carry water, to carry wheat, to cook on the fire, whatever. But every single one of them is beautifully decorated. Some of them very realistically, some of them geometrically, some of them in ways that she can't quite make out what the picture would have been, but it's clear that there was an informed eye making that picture. She says, that's really incredible. It would seem, she says, as if no matter where the human being is, no matter who they are, where they live, or when they're living, the need to make something beautiful out of the thing that is practical is overwhelming. Why, she says, why did they do that? Why did they decorate these vessels? What compels them to take that extra time and effort? And she thinks, well, they probably, even then, as they were making these vessels and putting their lines on them, they must have known there would come a time when they would not be. And they needed to leave a record. So we're back to this notion of the human artifact, the human remain, the human spot, thing, shape, recognizable, record, literate, art, is the thing that is what we do. And we do it against the dark, and we do it against loss, and we do it against death, and we do it against not being. We can't not do it. And for her, that's extraordinarily confirming, that she can be like the vessel, filled with the water that is sound, and she will thereby become an artist. That she's not doing anything other than being a vessel for something else. And that she has no choice but to do it, because that is the most human thing to do. From there, she goes on. She leaves America. She goes to Europe. She spends many years training. And she comes back to America and to old friends. And she is absolutely an artist. She's a diva. And one old friend who goes to see her after a concert watches her upon the stage, and he sees this glittering woman filled with energy and vigor and life and gorgeous sound and sort of dazzling upon the stage. Runs up behind the stage afterwards to be at her door when she comes out, and he looks at her, and she is haggard. And she looks, he says, 60 years old and hollow. And he realizes that she isn't being the vessel right now, that she is indeed hollow. She's been filled, and now she's emptied. So now I want to go back to my Antonia for just one moment as kind of a way of concluding. Cather, I would really argue, and I've got lots of stuff to work with, all her life never stopped thinking about what makes art, what makes the artist, and who am I as that American artist. And yet I think all the critics, and rightly say, that of all of her novels, My Antonia, which is early in her career, is probably her best. And so I keep having to go back there to think about what art means for her. And I remember how dissatisfied I was when I was much younger at the notion that art was having all these babies and losing all your teeth. And I kept thinking, oh, is that all there is? But, having just told you the story of the empty vessel that Thea becomes, I recognize what Antonia is, right? She's the vessel. And so I guess the argument ultimately that I would make is that for Cather, that artist is the empty bowl. And in its emptiness, that is its decoration. That is its beauty, is just to hold its form, allow its form to contain the power that is art. And when that art is finished, well, you look pretty bad, frankly. You're no work of art yourself. The thing you produced is. If you read very much about people who met Cather, they all say two things. One is, she was a very hefty woman. And the other is, she wasn't very friendly. And I think, yep. She may have been hefty, but I'll bet she was an empty vessel. She may not have been nice, but boy, could she hold the stuff that filled her. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions or to hear you disagree or whatever. Thank you.
That's the first question. And it relates to everything you've been talking about.
Yeah, it does.
And the second question is the pronunciation of my Antonia.
We had this discussion earlier.
I just have struggled so to keep the accents in the right places. But
You know, I have never heard anyone call it anything other than my Antonia, even though early in the novel she tells us, don't say my Antonia, right?
Yes.
My Antonia.
that's
The
where
way we say Anton.
it's like
my
Dvorak.
Antony.
Right. Okay.
But really, I've never heard anybody say anything other than my Antonia.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
She'd roll over and, you know, she's probably rolling over now. Hi.
Hi. Seems that Willa Cather was doing a lot of sort of autobiographical stuff through the three stories you spoke about. And probably lots has been written regarding her position as a woman in the day and a successful woman. And I wonder if you would just like to comment about that.
She is writing autobiographically because she says memories are what we write from. And that's what she recognizes as the only source. So she's always writing about what was, it seems to me. In terms of, you know, herself as a woman, I mean, her urge not to be identified as a woman is incredibly strong. Oh, is it strong. I mean, she dresses as a boy when she's a little girl. Was she cross-dressing? I have no idea. What did it mean? I don't know. She called herself Dr. Willa Cather. Do I know what that meant? No, I don't know what it means. What did it mean at that point it would have been 1880 to say, hi, I'm Willa Cather. I don't know. What did when she went to the University of Nebraska, her first year there, she's dressed as a boy. Well, to be honest, I don't know what that means either insofar as the new woman. Her costume is anything but feminine. And I'm working on these photographs and, you know, early pictures of her, and you just think, honey, you looked better when you were dressed more like a boy, because when you switch to the women's clothing, it's god-awful. What did it mean for her to succeed? Well, it meant for her to succeed not as a woman. The only women authors she can think of are women who write drivel. How does she know it's drivel? She read it. Why did she read it? She loved it. She read it all as a kid. She read everything she could find, and the more scurrilous, the better. In Coming Aphrodite, she has a young woman who becomes an opera singer. She likes opera singers. She's an opera critic. Who was a young girl, is up in her mother's attic reading what we can only think of as dirty books, who then takes them downstairs and reads them under the cover. Where did Cather come up with this detail? A student once said to me, gee, I can't imagine. I said, in those days, I'm sure Cather, you know. I'm sure that in 1896, 1899, seems pretty modern to me. Freud's around. She later does read Freud. She doesn't think much of him. She reads a lot of Balzac. Georges Sand. She doesn't like women.
But I mean George Sand. Also cross-dressing.
True. I mean, it's a bit of a, but Cather stops cross-dressing after her sophomore year and takes up the most regrettable clothing I've ever seen in my life. I really. I have pictures of my grandmother from the same period, and my grandmother's hats were also awful, but the rest of her clothing wasn't. And Cather goes in for what she thinks of as opera capes, and there are thousands of like discs of chiffon. And Cather, as I said, was not a small woman, and they're capes, big round capes. And then she's got a hat that has feathers on each side that stick up like this. And you just think, who told you? Who told you this was good? She did not lack for suitors. though I think she had a very sharp tongue, and I think any young man who approached her, man, he was tough stuff. That's all I can say. And I would, what did it mean for her to be successful as a woman? She did not think of herself as a woman, I think. Does that mean she thought she was a man? I don't know. Does it mean she was a lesbian? Well, I think she was. But the term didn't exist yet. It will by the time she's dead, by the time she's old. What she did with whom? Oh, everybody'd sure like to know, because everybody's got a theory. I actually find that part uninteresting. I find her thinking about being an artist more interesting. I mean, I guess I think that if there is passion and eroticism, it's there in the notion of creating art for Cather. And that creation of art is indeed without gender, which is to say it's masculine. Gender is female and to be done away with, and it's limited and it writes trash. Henry James, come on, real man. She's read Eliot. You do not hear her saying, God, I wish I could write like, you just don't hear it. Well, I think she was too, but
I just have a small comment on that, because her relationships are what I picked up on Antonia and in the Song of the Lark.
yeah,
They're platonic.
yeah.
They're not the sexual passion.
Do you mean the male-female relationships?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Jim does finally say, I have loved her
Yes.
for so long. And as a child, as children, they played.
And he wants
This
to
was
kiss
the
Lena.
old- he does, but he doesn't.
But he doesn't. That is correct.
So
And he marries
there's that
unhappily.
distance and the reluctance to enter into the drivel. And I think that's what you're saying, that she doesn't want to lower her idealism of a man-woman relationship that is
You may be right.
pure as an ideal.
But you know, you're absolutely right. She doesn't want to lose that idealized relationship. But what's so contradictory here? I mean, here we have Antonia, right, as the great artist, regenerating life, the vessel. But boy, did she know that the thing that was going to kill the artist was to get married and have children.
Yeah.
No way was she going to be a mother. No way was she going to have children. No, 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 no. She's going to create art, but not that kind. So part of me wants to think that we get the kinds of heterosexual relationships we do because she's just, no. Those male characters are her. Jim Burton, certainly. It's just very hard for me to not see herself pouring herself into Jim Burton as her vessel. And there are no children for Jim. Antonia has his children with Anton. And Jim becomes kind of, I think it's fair to say he loves one of Antonia's children, who he describes as like a little Pan, a little fawn figure, little pointy ears, kind of gracefully, mischievously prancing all around, a figure as much animal as it is human.
The doctor in Song of the Lark says similar things about Taya when she's very small and
Yes,
sick.
yes. Yes.
What about Alexandria's husband?
Alexandra's husband, she marries Carl Lindstrom when they're both considerably older, and it is a marriage of old friends. And they both say, what could be better than to marry your oldest and best friend? And my students always say, well, I got some ideas what could be better. And, you know, I've gone back and forth on this. Sometimes I try to convince them, oh, it's really fun to marry your best friend. And other times I say, well, why do you think she did that? And then I don't want to hear their answers because people didn't have sex in those days. They hadn't invented it yet. Only they invented it last week. So students are always disappointed at that ending. I find it a lovely ending because so many terrible things have happened because of sexual love in that novel. There's her brother and another young woman. Yeah.
Should I? Oh, hi. I have a question. Are there any associations that you know of between Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, and Willa Cather?
Not
And
to my
also,
knowledge.
What was Willa's relationship with her father?
To my knowledge, I don't know if she read Jung, and I don't know that she knew much about him. Cather's father, Cather comes from a fairly large family in a very small house. And her father was a not very successful middle management banker. There was never enough money and there was never enough room. She was very close to her parents. And she made many, many, many trips back to Red Cloud to see them. Her father died first and then her mother, and she seemed to be in deep mourning for both of them. But she was the oldest, and she was also a kind of mother figure to her siblings. So she felt that, and she stayed very close to them, she felt that she, and she writes about that she kept her parents alive because she had her siblings.
Apropos her cross-dressing, it seems to me that we may be looking at a sort of a cultural lost wax process there, because in those days cross-dressing was much more common than much more accepted than it is now. For example, it was routine to dress and coif boys as girls. I have a photo of my father circa 1903.
Yes. And you know, some of those little boys and girls' dresses show up. And in fact, the little boy at the beginning of Oh Pioneers who's lost his kitten up a tree is, to my students' horror, is described as wearing skirts.
I also wanted to ask, what was her connection with Keene, New Hampshire?
Jaffrey. And I said Keene, she's buried in Jaffrey. She and Edith Lewis went to Jaffrey for summers for like 8 years. There are some very funny stories about Cather and Jaffrey and getting locked out and climbing up a window and getting caught in the window. And
are we talking about the McDowell colony?
No, we're not. No. There was a large inn. Yes. And she just loved it. And she did a lot of writing there. And so part of her reason for going there was that she could get a lot of writing done, that it was quiet. She liked to write outside. No surprise. And if she couldn't write outside, then she liked to write in a room with windows to the outside. The exact opposite of what she had in New York, where all of the windows in her room looked onto a brick wall. But she said it was very quiet, so it was fine. The other place she spent a great deal of time at was a small island off New Brunswick.
I had a question about what she thought of Freud. I actually have 2 questions. And what she thought of the voice, what the art was that was going through her. And I remember being incredibly moved by her compassion for the murderer in the Oh Pioneers, I think it was. I might have the story wrong, but that it seemed to me that she had this brilliant and compassionate view of human beings and beyond convention. And that is very moving to me. And that about people in the land is very simple, and I guess what I associate with New England. And then I was also wondering why she was buried in Joffrey.
She had said she wanted to be buried there. I have no idea, other than that she and Edith spent wonderful summers there. Why she preferred that to Red Cloud, well, actually, I think, and this is just my opinion, I think for all of her love of the West, and she did love it, and she's very forthright about loving its empty landscape, though that is what drives many people wild. I think she didn't want to be buried that far from New York, frankly. I think she wanted to be where she thought there was more happening. I think she wanted to be visited. I think she wanted Edith Lewis in a little tiny coffin at her feet, which is where Lewis's headstone is at her feet. Woman lived with her for 28 years. And she's buried at Cather's feet. I find that just too icky. You know, if you live with somebody like an author for a long time, you form a very intimate relationship with them, and it is as if I'm talking to her something. Oh, shut up, Willa. Jeez. So, you know, I think she can be a creep at times.
Which American writers were her contemporaries that she admired? And did she associate at all with Edith Wharton, for example?
She had met Wharton. She does not say a lot about Wharton. I mean, it would seem as if the two of them should have a wonderful conversation, right? Mm-mm. She hangs around with guys. Cather is very, very, very modern. She is a real publicity hound. She is right in there honing her image. She is right in there with advertising. So, yeah, she goes to Bread Loaf, and she knows Mabel Dodge Luhan. Mabel Dodge Luhan is in the Southwest, but also in New York, and she goes to many soirees. She knows D.H. Lawrence. She begins by liking him, but he evidently said something to her at a party that really didn't sit well, and she turns against him, and she has very mean things to say about his loathsome writing. I mean, that's what she thinks of it. She doesn't particularly care for Hemingway. I don't recall anything about Joyce. Well, she loves Jewett, and Jewett is her mentor early in her life. And Cather was, you know, and you will not be surprised if I tell you she takes Jewett's short stories and she kind of reassembles them into an edition of Country of the Pointed Firs, and she puts in more stories than Jewett had put into the original edition. Why does she do that? She wants a heftier book. She writes a preface for it. She says, look, this is not just a light little, this is a real book. And it's an important piece of American art. I agree with her totally. But what she does to make sure that that is a real book is kind of pad it. So, you know, with students, I have to say, which edition have you got? No, none of that one. No. Those stories are not part of the original. We'll read them, but they're not part of the original. So she loves Jewett. But Jewett loved her. And it's Jewett who says, don't spend all of your energy in your life working for money. Use your energy in your life for your art. And Cather does. And it's Jewett who introduces her to Henry James. Jewett has quite a nice soiree herself. And anybody who's anybody comes to Jewett's house. Cather talks about sitting there in the living room, absolutely quiet as a mouse, trying not to spill her tea, while Emerson and she's just naming all these people who are in the room with her. They're the literati, as she calls them, and she is the illiterati. She's always, I think all her life, she's very aware of her farm upbringing, her Middle West upbringing, it's as if she always thinks she has soil on her feet. Which is to say, you know, she didn't really like many American authors of her own time. She liked the guys from the past, and she liked Europe. And she read well in French and German, so.
Speaking of Europe, at the beginning you had mentioned Cather's interest in being the author, and you mentioned Proust specifically. I kept noticing these things popping up throughout the talk, the notion of the role that memory plays, the art as life. And in particular, there was an interesting note of the magic lantern. Did she know? Proust would have started coming out about the time she was winding down. But I was just
right, Proust is coming out the time she's winding down. Did she read him? I don't know for certain. I'd be really surprised if she didn't. I really would. You know, one of the things that I so regret is that, to my knowledge, nobody made a a list of all the books in Cather's library. And I've always wanted that. Just because they're there, of course, doesn't mean she read them, but it does mean she kept them. So I honestly don't know, but it's hard. She's a very modern writer, and she's looking at a very modern world, and she is reading what's coming out. I think she's reading it in part to say, I'm better than that. And sometimes she's not reading it that way. She's reading it because Flaubert is so beautiful. But I'd be really surprised if she didn't read Proust. Really surprised. Thank you very much. It was really fun. It's so nice to talk to adults.